And so to recap and review then, at the end of our third week of understanding art, which is also the first half of our discussion of post-World War II German art. Next week we'll move into the second half of the discussion of post-World War II German art with artists like Gerhard Richter and Anselm Kiefer. Richter was present at Dusseldorf at about the same time that Joseph Beuys was there, and Kiefer was one of his students. So we'll see how this tradition continues in the following set of courses in the fourth week. But to recap and review, what we've essentially seen is that Dusseldorf and the Kunstakademie there at Dusseldorf essentially has become the rival to New York City. It's going along right at the same time. The career of Joseph Beuys, as we've seen, is exactly parallel with that of Andy Warhol in the 1960s. So there are two centers, at least two centers, but there are more. Interesting things are going on in Vienna as well. The Vienna actionists are active at this time. But Dusseldorf and New York are the two main centers of contemporary art during the 1960s and 70s. And the Germans are rivaling it, if not surpassing it. They are, for the first time, as we have seen, at the avant-garde of art, largely due to the Art Academy at Dusseldorf and to Joseph Beuys. And we looked at Joseph Beuys in a series of 3 lectures, and we saw how essentially his work could be subdivided into 3 distinct phases. The first phase, which I've called Cosmology A, was preoccupied with the kind of shamanistic worldview in which the human body became the surface of inscription for the various signifiers that have to do with the shamanistic world of the becomings animal. There's a kind of Goethean interest in the etheric and astral forces that animate plants and animals. Animals and humans are interactive. Humans are becoming animals. Animals are becoming humans. And it's a cosmology that's very traditional, very modernistic in that sense. But long about 1958 or so, that cosmology began to melt down, and we saw how Beuys moved into his mature period, Cosmology B, in which that human world is precisely what disappeared. The realm of the human being, the human figure, and the traces of a living, vital human culture disappeared and left behind simply traces, like nomads at a campfire who have left, and then someone else arrives, and what they see before them are the traces of the campfire, the little bits and pieces of charcoal and stuff, bits and pieces of food and utensils that have been left behind. That's essentially the cosmology of Beuys now, who has brought in a cosmology of traces, used objects such as bathtubs and pianos that have been re-territorialized because they have survived and been fished out of a world where there has been a catastrophe that has occurred. And so these objects have been fished from the rubble as traces, and they've been re-territorialized. That is to say, they've been given new significance in the new world horizon of contemporary art, significances that they did not have before. And in re-territorializing them, the artist essentially gives them new abysses of hitherto unsuspected meaning potentiality. A piano no longer necessarily has to be the instrument as it was for Beethoven for sounding out the creator's cosmic harmonies, but it now becomes wrapped in piano and it becomes a symbol of communication breakdown. And so this other tendency, the entropic tendency for objects to break down, lose their ability to communicate and to recede and break away from each other, is the counter tendency in Beuys's mature period to the study of his sort of Rudolf Steinerian cosmic evolutionary forces, the astral and etheric spiritual forces that form the impersonal cosmic forces that have gobbled up the human universe. The human being is no longer the concern of his art during this period. It's concerned with impersonal forces on the one hand and traces on the other, but also this opposed entropic tendency in which there is communication breakdown and the various actions that he began to take part in, beginning with the Fluxus actions, were an attempt to redress communication breakdown by trying to reinscribe and create new pathways, new ways of connecting entities through opening up new channels of communication between them. And then in his third period, we saw how his art declined into monumentalization. The entropic objects largely disappeared from the art. Felt disappeared for the most part. It was absorbed by the batteries, which became a symbol for conducting spiritual potential in society and social transformation. And the art began to monumentalize and get larger and larger, and to reiterate many of the same points that the earlier art, the smaller art, had made. And then we moved on to look at Odd Nerdrum, and we saw how with Odd Nerdrum, Odd Nerdrum was this Norwegian painter who was a student of Joseph Beuys and also was a student, as it were, of Rudolf Steiner. Both men studied Rudolf Steiner, and the art of both men constitutes a response to the contemporary scientific industrial landscape, standing up for humanistic values, spiritual values that both men have inherited from their studies of Rudolf Steiner. Beuys has went the way of contemporary art and the avant-garde. Nerdrum went back the other way to a more traditional art form that he saw as being consistent with a humanistic worldview. If you're going to have humanistic values, traditional values, spiritual values, an emphasis on myth, tradition, and storytelling, then according to Nerdrum, what you really need to have is also a traditional art form, such as the perspectival art, the figurative art of the old masters, which is dismissed by by the Academy as kitsch. The dismissive term kitsch is used by the Academy to refer to this kind of figurative representation, but Nerdrum reterritorializes the word kitsch to mean something positive. It means painting traditional representations well. It's a craftsmanly aspect that goes along with humanistic values. He sees modern art essentially being as an art form that's essentially inhumanist and cold and is in league, therefore, with the scientific worldview. Modernist art is a scientific art. It's an art that goes right along with a scientific industrial civilization, a civilization that Heidegger termed that of enframing, Gestell, that Nerdrum is reacting against. He sees modernist art as something that's spiritually inauthentic. It's too scientific, it's too cold, it's too inhuman, and so he's retrieved the warm glow of the realm of the campfire and the storytelling tradition in creating, as we have seen, this sort of private micro world for which the primary myths are missing. Whatever the signifieds were for his art, they're not there, and all Nerdrum gives us are these signifiers. We know what the values are. They're humanistic values, this world of post-literate, tribal-oriented, oral individuals who are existing in a realm where their primary activities are telling myths and stories and the power of song and singing, and all of that on an earth that appears to be expanding. It's because, again, it's in league with this idea of kitsch as geocentric. It's expanding on an earth that has a numinous, living spiritual power on its own. It actually is alive, even though it's been denuded of vegetation, so that Nerdrum can make the point, on the one hand, that industrial civilization has rendered contemporary society a wasteland, but on the other, it's enabled him to clear everything out of the way so that he can emphasize the humanistic values of his humanistic protagonists on this expanding earth. And so for him, it's important to retrieve the values of the old masters because those are the values that he sees as compatible with the spiritual humanistic worldview, whereas Joseph Beuys, coming from basically the same perspective, the humanistic worldview, has reterritorialized art by retrieving objects from the collapsed midden heap of a previous age and reinscribing them with new functions. And in doing that, he had to invent a new art, basically because meaning had shifted after World War II. It had become something totally different. And so the meaning conditions, what it means for an object to mean anything at all, had changed. And so Beuys saw the necessity to create a new art style, and he became the leading exponent of Dusseldorf in the 60s and all the way up into the 70s. And so that brings us to the end of the third week here. And a final assignment might be for the interested person to compare and contrast Joseph Beuys and Nerdrum, since both were pupils of Rudolf Steiner. Both had humanistic values, but yet both respond to the crisis of modernity in very drastically different ways. And so the individual might, as a final assignment, want to take a work, a painting of Nerdrum's and a work of Joseph Beuys, and compare and contrast them and show how each one responds in a completely different way to the same crisis. And that might be a good project for ending the third week.